When we're looking at the digestive tract, we actually are dealing with the mouth, the esophagus, stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. But it has a lot of other aspects to it. So what I'm going to start is by looking at the mouth. And even before that, I'm going to tell you something a little interesting. There's something called the gastrocephalic reflex. And the gastrocephalic reflex is pretty much the reflex you get when you eat, see, or smell anything you find appealing to eat. Best way to describe it is if you think of being in a barbecue and you smell the burgers cooking, you smell the meat, you smell everything that you're going to eat, it starts getting your stomach to make some funny noises. Well, that's actually meant to make as you put it in your mouth, you are using all the muscles of mastication. You can see some of them here. You're also going to use the specialized tissue of the teeth, which are actually really complex. You can see a lot more of them. You're also going to use 3 glands. This one here is called the parotid. This one here is called the submandibular. You can see the mandible here cut. And this one here is called the sublingual. These should make sense because sublingual underneath the tongue, submandibular underneath the mandible, parotid is on the side here. And these 3 are going to secrete mucus, electrolytes, and something called amylase. And amylase is an enzyme that breaks apart sugars. So you're going to put food stuff in your mouth. And you're going to break it apart mechanically with your teeth, but it's not going to chemically be broken down. Only some sugars are able to be broken down in the mouth. And as you swallow this, you go down the esophagus. So you can see how the esophagus is behind the trachea. It is part of the mediastinum. And when it gets to the diaphragm, which would be around here, it ends up going into the stomach. And you have a cardiac sphincter. Now, the tissue from the mouth all the way down the esophagus, the tissue that's lining that is going to be stratified squamous epithelium. So it pretty much is going to be a lot of small cells stacked one on top of each other. You're also going to have a smooth muscle tube in here, which is made up of 2 layers. One of it is going to be circular, the other is longitudinal. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow this to contract and bring things down to the stomach. Now, at the stomach, you have a sphincter here called the cardiac sphincter. And the cardiac sphincter closes the stomach contents off from the esophagus. So you eat stuff, when it's in the mouth and you swallow it, it's called a bolus. When it gets to the stomach, it's called chyme. And in the stomach, you have different regions. If you notice, you have this little curvature and this big curvature, which are called the lesser and greater curvatures. You have this area here called the cardiac zone. This lump here is called the fundus. This entire thing up to here is called the body, and this here is a pylorus. Now, you do have the circular and longitudinal muscles in here, but the tissue inside the lumen is going to change. And you have a third muscle layer deep to the circular muscle, which is going to pull the stomach at different angles, and that's called your oblique muscle layer. Now, the tissue lining the inside is going to be simple cuboidal epithelium, and you're going to have goblet cells again. And goblet cells, you remember from respiratory, produce mucus. In this case, you want the mucus there to protect the lining of the stomach from what's inside here. Now, you also have something called the gastric pit, and these gastric crypts, which branch in. And in the crypts, you have gastric glands, which can secrete hydrochloric acid. You can also secrete proteolytic enzymes, which are proteins that break apart other proteins. And you can also, in certain areas, secrete something called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is needed for you to be able to absorb vitamin B12. Now, if you think about the hydrochloric acid is going to break apart pretty much anything. It's acid. And the way it comes is really neat. I'm going to use a piece of paper so I could show you the equation. If you remember, you have carbon dioxide and water, and this comes together to form carbonic acid, H2CO3, and hydrogen plus HCO3 minus. Now, this hydrogen is taken by the cells in the stomach called parietal cells, and they're pumped into the lumen of the stomach. The other thing that happens is if you have sodium chloride, which is just salt, when you put it in water, it becomes sodium, and an ion, and a chloride ion. So what you're going to do is you're going to take this chloride and you're going to dump it into the stomach. So you're going to have hydrogen and chloride making hydrochloric acid. And you also have the proteolytic enzymes, which are proteins that are going to break apart other proteins. Now, so far in the body, you don't have any absorption. So we're actually here in the stomach, and no absorption has happened. You can't absorb caffeine, alcohol, and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories from the stomach, and they go straight to the liver, which can end up causing problems. Now, as we go past the stomach, so from the stomach we end up getting to the small intestine. The first part of the small intestine is the duodenum, which this is the best image of the duodenum. The reason is you have your liver up here, you have your gallbladder here, you can see your pancreas here. And these three, the liver and the pancreas, are going to secrete stuff that goes into the small intestine. The pancreas in particular, you're going to have sodium bicarbonate, you're going to have lipase, and you're going to have some amylase. The liver is going to secrete something called bile salts. And I'm going to take a pause in lymphatics. You remember how the old red blood cells are eaten in the spleen and sent to the splenic vein, to the hepatoportal vein, to the liver, where it's conjugated, made water soluble, make bile salts. Now, bile salts are a detergent. They can actually dissolve fat and water. So what they do is they come in the small intestine and they meet the stuff that's coming out of the stomach called chyme, and in the duodenum here, the acid gets neutralized by the bicarbonate. Lipase starts breaking apart some of the fats. Amylase breaks apart the sugars. On the border of the small intestine, you end up having a lot more proteolytic enzymes, which are going to break apart proteins. And the bile salts are going to take big globs of fat and act like soap. So instead of having big globs of fat, you have a bunch of little globs of fat, so lipase can work better. Now, so far I haven't talked about absorption, but you can absorb in the small intestine. And that's done because of the way that the small intestine actually works. If we were to draw a sample of the small intestine, what we would see is we'd see a bunch of some connective tissue coming this way, and we'd have these circular called plica. And in the plica, the tissue on top of that is simple cuboidal columnar epithelium, and it has these finger-like projections called villi. So we have a plica and we have villi. Now the tissue here is going to be long cuboidal cells. And yes, it is going to have some goblet cells every so often, which acute mucus. And inside this area, we have capillary beds coming in, and we also have a lymphatic capillary inside. So if we were going to take one of these villi and blow it up, what we would see is we'd see a finger-like projection with a simple columnar epithelium all over it, and inside you would have a capillary bed. Now this capillary bed is attached to the superior mesenteric artery, and it goes back the inferior mesenteric vein. And inside you have a lymphatic capillary called a lacteal. What ends up happening is this: you've taken your proteins and you break those apart to amino acids. Your carbohydrates, you break them to simple sugars, monosaccharides. Fats are broken down into triglycerides, free fatty acids, and cholesterols. And what ends up happening is the amino acids and monosaccharides, which are water soluble, can go into the capillary bed. And from the capillary bed, they go into the venules, into the superior mesenteric vein, into the hepatoportal vein, and straight to the liver. And so the liver is actually important because it's getting the sugars and amino acids before anything else, which means they could control the sugar levels based on concentration. Now, the fatty acids and triglycerides and cholesterols, they can't go into the blood because they're fat soluble. Instead, they go straight into the lacteal. And the lacteal goes into your lymphatic system, and that's why I talked about the lymphatic system first. Now, after you get to the small intestine, we'll go to this picture here. You have the different regions. You have the duodenum, the jejunum, which is the main one. Then you have a little area here, which connects to the large intestine. And in the large intestine, you call it the colon. And this specific area is called the cecum. And the cecum goes up this way, so you have it, call it the ascending colon. It folds here, which as the liver is here, we call it the hepatic flexure. We turn this way, which it moves transversely, so we call it transverse colon. Over here you have the spleen, so you have the splenic flexure. The descending colon comes down this way. Then you have this S-shaped area here, so we call it the sigmoid colon. And then we get to the rectum and the anus. And in the anus, we have two areas that are important for, you have two muscles that are important to let this go through, and that is the internal and external anal sphincter. Now, the small intestine that we talked a lot about, that I talked most about, is really needed for absorption of nutrients. Almost all your nutrients are absorbed there. Your large intestine over here really is mostly to absorb water and to absorb intrinsic factor bound to B12. You also have a lot of bacteria in there, which helps you stay healthy. That we went through all that, I will tell you a little bit about the liver. Now, the liver is actually divided into different lobes. You have the right and left lobe, and if you go to the back, you can see other areas. You can see that you have a lobe, and I'm going to use green as it shows up really nice. This lobe here, which is on the back, and it looks kind of like a tail. So we call it the caudate lobe. Over here, you have one area that looks kind of square, so they call it the quadrate lobe. This one would technically be your right. This one would be, I'm sorry. And you can see the hepatoportal vein coming in here. You can see the gallbladder here, which will make it green, why not? Common bile duct, comes together with the hepatic duct, and this is what's going to end up going to your intestines. You also have these veins here, coming from the liver into your inferior vena cava, which are called your hepatic veins, which we talked about earlier. Now, there are some ligaments you can look at. You can actually find them in the lab, and that's pretty much it, except for tissues. Now, like I said, the tissues of the mouth and digestive tract I already talked about, but I didn't tell you about the tissues of the liver. Now, here you can see the liver. And what you notice is you have, well, if you look closely, you can actually see an octahexagon type structure here. There's a lobule. You can see an artery, a vein, and another a bile duct. Artery here, vein here, bile duct here. And that's one of the important that's actually one of the important things about the liver. Remember, the liver is actually where you make most of your circulatory proteins. So blood goes to the liver with all the amino acids you need to fix it. It's also the main storage site for your sugar, and it makes a protein that's really important, which is called high-density lipoprotein. So you'll see HDL is high-density lipoprotein. It's made by the liver, and when it's made in the liver, it's actually sent to the bloodstream. Now, the other accessory organ we have is in the pancreas, and we have this area here called the islet of Langerhans. And mostly around here you have acinar cells, which are simple cuboidal. Now, in this area here, the islet of Langerhans, you have three cell types. You have the alpha, you have the beta, and the delta. Alpha makes something called glucagon. Beta makes insulin. And delta makes somatostatin. The two people usually deal with are these two. Now, when glucose is gone, when your blood sugar levels are low, you release glucagon, which goes to the liver, from the pancreas to the liver. You can see the artery here. And the veins actually also come there straight to the liver. And the glucagon will cause gluconeogenesis in the liver, causing you to make more sugar. Well, when you have too much glucose, you release insulin. And insulin gets your sugar into your cells, from your blood into the cells, and so they can be used. We now have the basics of the GI tract. So I just want to just real quick talk about what happens. So you have a mechanical breakdown of food in the mouth. You swallow it, goes to the stomach where it gets hit by acid and proteolytic enzymes. It goes into the small intestine and the duodenum where it gets neutralized. And from the duodenum, it goes to the jejunum where most of your absorption takes place of nutrients. But you're breaking everything down to the basic building blocks using enzymes from the pancreas, from the small intestinal wall, and bile salts from the liver, which can be stored in the gallbladder. Everything gets broken down to the smallest building block, and then it goes, if it's water soluble, it goes into the capillaries, which then ends up going into the superior mesenteric vein, which goes into the liver. If it's fat soluble, it goes into the lacteals, the thoracic duct, and ends up dropping into eventually your heart. Now, in your heart, the protein I told you about, the HDL here, HDL, binds with fatty acids, triglycerides, and cholesterol, and ends up becoming low-density lipoprotein. The reason is fatty acids and triglycerides have less density than protein. So as you end up putting fatty acids and triglycerides, it changes to low-density lipoprotein. Now this low-density lipoprotein will go to your liver, where the fat will come off, the HDL will be released, and you'll continue the process over and over again. That's pretty much the basics of the GI tract. I hope that's okay, and next time I'm going to start talking about endocrine. I hope you enjoyed this and found this useful. Goodbye.